Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping are, as we speak, sitting down for the first of the many engagements that they will be having over the next 2 days. The two leaders will be spending considerable amount of time with each other. Lots been made of the informality, which is the underlying tone of this meeting as well. Let's get in some further perspectives. Joining us on the broadcast are our esteemed guests. Joining us is former Indian diplomat Arun Singh. Also joining us is Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, former Indian ambassador to China, joining us from Gurugram in India. Also joining us is Aina Tangin, political and economic commentator. Coming to you first, Ambassador Chandrasekhar. As we've been discussing, informality is the key underlying tone for this meeting. What do you make of the speculation that surrounded this meeting, of how there will be a lot of considerable time, of course, that the two leaders will be spending? But what, according to you, are the outcomes that the two sides expect? All right, a bit of an audio glitch there. We'll just try and reconnect that line with Ambassador Chandrasekhar. But Ambassador Arun Singh is also with us here in our studios. Also is Aina Tangin joining us over Skype. Coming to you first, Ambassador Arun Singh. It's a larger idea that's been talked about for a while, of how they want to understand each other and do not want to declare anything, do not want to really come out and state what the outcomes really were. But what, according to you, would China hope to achieve at the end of those talks?
Molly, with some periodicity, an effort has been made to put India-China relations in a new context. First attempt was made in 1988 when Rajiv Gandhi went to China for the first time after the 1962 conflict. Next attempt was made in 2003 when Prime Minister Vajpayee went to China, and there was a declaration issued then on setting the new principles for the bilateral relationship, because that followed our nuclear tests and some difficulties in relations with China. So I think another attempt is being made now with the difficulties we had over the last couple of years dealing with Doklam, China blocking us at the nuclear suppliers group. And if you recall, to some extent, Prime Minister Modi made a similar attempt in 2014 when Chinese President Xi had come to India. And not only Delhi, he had gone to Gujarat and he had been welcomed in a big way. But that attempt faltered a bit because there was an incursion from China precisely while the visit was going on. So with all that, I think another attempt is being made, that how do you, through an understanding between the leaders, to a talk at the level of leaders, set a new framework for relations going forward. And a new framework is required because, especially compared to 1988, 2003, it's a new global situation. China has emerged on the global stage. Its GDP is 5 times India's GDP. It has enhanced military expenditure and strength. At the world level, it is seen as a power which is rising to challenge the US power. Russia has become heavily dependent on and linked to China. So with this ferment and flux taking place, what is the new parameter we can set for the India-China relationship? Right. So I think that is the attempt that will be made. Political relations, economic relations, people-to-people dimension of the relationship. How do you do that so that there is a less sense of adversity in the relationship? And you'd have seen that over the past some months, Indian officials and leaders have been talking about our differences should not become disputes, and we should prevent that. And that India-China relations are a factor of stability in a changing world. So that's the projection that is being done. And I think it makes sense for China also to have a not fully adversarial India as they try to expand their footprint on the regional and global stage.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Ambassador, also getting in further perspectives from Aina Tangin. The same question to you as well. What would China hope to achieve at the end of this informal meeting? Aina, if my voice is going through to you?
Well, I mean, China is looking for a way to engage India. This has been a long-held goal. If you recall, back in 2013, when Xi came to power, he said bluntly that China and India their relationship would define the next century. And I do believe this. You're talking about the power of markets. 40% of all the world's population between two countries with more middle-class people than the entire population of both Europe and the United States. So right now, these markets, these huge consumer markets, are the only means by which these flagging Western markets can grow. So they're going to be looking to get into these markets. And I think by combining, India and China will have a much stronger position.
But Einar, I also want to ask you the timing at which this meeting is taking place. A lot's been spoken about how, given the trade war that China and the US are currently engaged in, it's a very strong factor for these talks taking place at a time like this.
Well, obviously circumstances dictate, but if you look at the cold, hard logic of China and India combining their approach and sitting as equals at this table. I mean, for the past 60, 70 years, it's always been about capital. Who had capital? They would make the rule, golden rule. Today, things have changed dramatically. Now it's about consumer markets. You can have all the money in the world, but if you are not able to invest it and get return, it will dwindle away. So now India and China are taking their rightful place at the negotiating table, not as subservient colonial former entities, but as full-fledged partners in a world that is becoming more multilateral.
All right. That's, of course, a very important point that we've been talking about as well, Ambassador. How the timing at which this meeting is taking place is equally interesting. As I just asked Einar, the trade war that China and the US are engaged in is a very strong impetus for China to actually come on the discussion table with India. We're also looking at how China is losing influence when it comes to the Korean Peninsula as well. It seems, is it feeling sidelined at the moment?
No, I don't think China would feel sidelined as such. Of course, neither India nor China would have planned that the summit take place on the very same day that the two Koreas are having their summit.
It's an interesting coincidence.
It's a coincidence, and but I think once their process had started, they would not have wanted to change it just because of that. I would feel that the trade tension that is happening between China and the US will certainly influence the discussions and be a factor in the discussion, but it would not have been the primary motivator for holding this meeting, because at one level we have similarity of concern with China related to the tariffs that US has imposed on steel and aluminum. At the WTO we have asked to join the talks and US has not agreed to that process. These
are the latest live visuals coming in of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping.
另外一点呢，就是过去去的我们的沿海东部和西部的城市，那么这次选一个中部的城市，这样的形成全面的了解。
We understand Your Excellency have never been to Wuhan before, and we also understand you've been to the eastern cities and the western city in China. So Wuhan is located in central China. That's why we are placing the meeting in this city. This can help you, Your Excellency, to have a comprehensive understanding of my country.
这个地方呢，它的特点就是一个，它属于金子文化，属于长江文化。 那么你过去去过的西安呢，它属于这个汉唐，属于黄河文化。这个地方也是一个很有文化的。
Wuhan is a city with a lot of history. This place used to be the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of Chu in ancient times, and it is very representative of the Yangtze River civilization. And Your Excellency have been to Xi'an before. That city really represented the height of the Han and Tang dynasties in Chinese history, and it was the cradle of the Yellow River civilization.
这里在的就是中国近代的工业发展历史，洋务运动的当时在这里发生，是近代的一个工业中心。再有呢，它在这个也是一个革命的发源地。 这个辛亥革命的标志就是它从此结束了这个封建帝制， 那么再有这个新中国成立以后，还是中国这个工业重镇，也是一个交通枢纽，这里还是一个科教的。
We've also chosen Wuhan for a number of other reasons. In the early modern period, the so-called self-strengthening movement in China in the 19th century started really in this city. And then, in the modern period, the Wuchang uprising in 1911 also started here. It started a revolution which ended feudal dynastic rule in China. And then, since the founding of the People's Republic of China, Wuhan has emerged as a key industrial base and also a transportation hub. It is also known for its strong science and technological capabilities.
所以是安排的这个博物馆呢，也是中国在这个一级，它的特点是叫长江文明，走吧，几千年的文明。可以了，走吧。还留一个。
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping exchanging those notes of greetings. And this is, of course, going to be just the first of the many sit-downs that the two leaders will be having. Of course, one of them will also be during a boat ride that takes place over the next 2 days. So a lot to watch out for. This is just a short while after Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was accorded a red carpet welcome upon his arrival there. Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Indian leader, they're exchanging a firm handshake. Well, let's also get in further perspectives. All right, let's dip back to those visuals coming in.
文明都是沿着河流加深的，因为在印度也有5000年前的印度文明，它也是在印度河的这个地方产生的。
मुझे वुहान को आने का पहली बार मिला, लेकिन मुझे जब मैं गुजरात का मुख्यमंत्री था, इस प्रोविंस में आने का अवसर मिला था, क्योंकि मैं उस समय इतनी जॉर्जिश डैम के समय में बहुत सुना था, और जिस तेजी से आपने उसको बनाया था और जिस स्केल पे बनाया था, तो मैं जब उसके विषय में पढ़ता था तो मुझे बड़े आतंक होती थी। तो स्टडी टूर के रूप में मैं आया था और करीब करीब पूरा दिन वहाँ बिता करके हर बारीक चीज़ को मैंने स्टडी करने का प्रयास किया था।
的确，这是我第一次来到武汉，但是我之前来过湖北省，因为我担任古吉拉特省首席部长的时候，我曾经有机会到三峡工程考察，因为那个时候我看到了中国这么快这么大的规模建立这个三峡工程，给我留下了非常深刻的印象。
मैं बहुत प्रभावित हुआ था जिस प्रकार से वाटरवे के लिए काम किया, बिजली का काम किया और एक बहुत अच्छा टूरिस्ट सेंटर भी डेवलप हो गया।
因为当时我看到中国在这一样的电力站、发电站，还有大家的旅游中心，这个也给我非常深刻的印象。
The two leaders exchanging those points of greeting, and also, of course, the Indian leader talking a little bit about the first time that he visited the city. This is, of course, many years ago as a part of a study tour. So that's an interesting point that's coming out as well. We will, of course, keep hearing more from the two leaders over the next 2 days as they'll be spending considerable amount of time with each other. That, remember, is the entire motive of this informal summit that we're talking about. Let me go back across to Ambassador Chandrasekhar. If you can hear me, Ambassador, this is, of course, a crucial point when we have the two leaders engaging in a resetting of ties. A re-engagement is what many have called it, but the underlying tone of informality, of course, tells us that the larger objective is to try and understand where the other leader stands, to try and understand the policy of the other country.
Absolutely, you are quite right. It's an opportunity for an informal exchange of views. There is no fixed agenda, therefore either side is free to raise any issue that it considers important, and it gives an opportunity to both sides to develop a clearer understanding of what the interests and compulsions of the other side are, and to see how to carry the overall relationship further, to build on areas where there's a convergence of interests while setting aside issues where there is a divergence of interests, and to make sure also that in areas where there's divergence of interests, these divergences are managed, controlled, and are not allowed to develop into crisis situations.
Ambassador, if I were to ask you what, according to you, would be the talking points when the two leaders sit down for those talks? Of course, only with the interpreters. There will be no note takers. There will be no joint agreement. But what, to your mind, will be the talking points?
An interest in exploring ways in which the border issue can be managed. A settlement is not in sight immediately, it's not a short-term prospect, but it's important to ensure that tensions do not arise in the border, and I think both sides will explore ways in which peace and tranquility can be better maintained on along the line of actual control. I think that will be very important to both sides. I think also the question of carrying our economic relations forward will be an important issue, in particular Chinese investments in India, and also at least a partial rectification of the trade imbalance between China and India. And the third thing, I think this is more important in the case of the Chinese. You see, it's not simply in a bilateral context that these discussions are taking place. There's also a broader global context, in particular shift in US policies, which have now become somewhat unpredictable and also transactional in nature. China faces a major problem here because there's the risk of a trade confrontation, of a trade war, as some would put it, between the United States and China, the world's two major trading powers. India does not face an issue of that magnitude, but there are certain aspects of US policy, for example, the Russia sanctions instituted recently, which caused discomfort both to India and to US allies such as the European Union. Germany, for example, has protested strongly against this. And this is a bearing for us because of our close defense supply relationship with Russia. So this probably would be in the back of the minds of both leaders. As I said, this is of more consequence to the Chinese side than for the Indian side. But it's not altogether absent on our side also, so I would imagine.
Indeed, just hold that thought there, Ambassador. Ambassador Arun Singh, it's a very interesting opportunity for India as well. When we talk about the trade war that China and US find themselves engaged in, it also then provides an opportunity for India. And it's also almost refreshing to see the two leaders engage in such a way and try and resurrect a relationship which was, if I may, on the cusp of war just last year.
So certainly there was some tension, but I think if you look at the manner in which some of the conversation played out, they allowed people to listen in to the conversation for a while. So that was a deliberate signal. And in the conversation, our Prime Minister referred to his earlier visit, but also to the technical and economic prowess of China. So a signal that we attach importance to that and we look for cooperation in that framework.
Absolutely, and the very fact that these are talks that are going to be taking place only in the presence of interpreters. There are not going to be any note takers. There will be no agreement that will be inked at the end of those talks. Andrew, how has China viewed this visit and what are the expectations that China really has? Einar, if my voice is going through to you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said Andrew. Yeah, the expectations of China, as I've said before, is they want a big picture understanding of how India sees the world. I mean, everything that the ambassador said about the intransience and transactional nature of Donald Trump, the tweet diplomacy, his attack on what is the multilateral trade system, is very disturbing, not only to India, but to many others, including the very close allies like the European Union. So I think there's some kind of desire to understand, get a mutual page on each other and how they see Donald Trump and how this is going to play out. It's very important. The United States is the largest power. Donald Trump has indicated that he believes that the U.S. must be the #1 military, economic, and political power in the world, and that everybody else should support that for ideological reasons, American exceptionalism and this idea of driving towards one system for the world. I don't know that that is in India's future interests, and I think it's more about now looking at whether there's a balance that can be had between having a security relationship with the United States on one hand and a very good trade relationship with China on the other.
All right, and Ambassador Chandrasekhar, we're also looking at how different players have reacted to this meeting as well. We're also looking at how Pakistan has... would you say that the statement that Pakistan gave out in the meeting somewhat smelled of nervosity?
Pakistan, perhaps understandably, was somewhat concerned about the outcome, and they went into discussions with China to assuage these concerns. And they've come out with a statement expressing confidence in the future of Sino-Pakistan relations. I think all this is to be expected. It's on par. There's nothing exceptional or unusual about the Pakistani reaction.
All right, we're going to leave it there for the moment. Ambassador Arun Singh, Ambassador Chandrasekhar, and also Anna Tangian. Appreciate very much you joining us on the broadcast and also broadening for us and explaining to our viewers what the objectives or the underlying tones really for those talks between the two leaders will be. We'll, of course, keep a close eye on the latest coming in from Wuhan, where the two leaders are meeting.